Hello, everyone. My name is Arteranth, and welcome to my author rambles. If you have not yet signed up for my newsletter, do so today at arteranth.substack.com. Or if you have not picked up a copy of my book, Reasons Found in Promises, check the description for universal purchase links. Now, on to the author ramble. Today, I wanted to talk a little bit about Romantasy and how it fails both its authors and readers as a genre label. The main issue that I see with it is that when you take a look at the books that we lump together under the Romantasy label, we actually see majorly two types of books that fall into one of two subgenres of two completely different genres, those being fantasy romance and romantic fantasy. Now, I know it might sound like I'm just switching words around, but there is a little bit of a technicality here that I think is important to address. You see, when I was looking into self-publishing and marketing my book, Reasons Found in Promises, I got to a point that all self-published authors eventually get to, which is trying to genre identify my book. And during the process of doing so, I found a few conventions that genre identification follows. The major one is that when you have a genre train of sorts, right, multiple genres in a line, right, dark fantasy, romance, for example, is a common one. The last genre that you see is the actual genre of the book. Everything before that are descriptors or little sub-categorizations that more so describe and augment the plot rather than our genres themselves. Kind of similarly to how in the English language, when you have an object, it's going to be at the end with everything following it being the adjectives that describe it. So a big purple elephant describes an elephant that is big and purple. In that way, fantasy romance describes a capital R romance in a fantasy setting. So this is incredibly important, especially for romance, because romance has two major qualifications, right, that make it a romance, and one of them is rather unique. The first one is pretty obvious, which is that the book must have a romantic relationship. Very commonly, it's two people, but in recent years, we have seen an influx of more than that. So, but a romantic relationship nonetheless that drives the plot. It is central and core to the book. You cannot rip it out. You cannot change it to be platonic. It must be there in order for the book to progress the way it does. Right? The second one is the unique one, which is that this romantic relationship gets an HEA, or a happily ever after. The basic definition of that is the romantic relationship must be together. They are going to be together for the foreseeable future, and they're going to be happy. So, of course, slightly different takes on the happily ever after, and kind of unconventional happily ever afters are a thing. But the main thing that makes something qualify is that it is an uplifting note. It ends the book on a happy tone that is, well, the opposite of tragic, for a lack of a better word. Right? And this is incredibly important because that means that when you are trying to market to romance readers, for example, fantasy romance readers, those are expectations that those readers have. Of course, they are not a monolith, but the qualifications exist for a reason, which is, success in marketing to that audience, which is where the issue with fantasy romance being lumped in with romantic fantasy comes in, because romantic fantasy describes a book that is a fantasy first, and fantasy does not have a requirement of any type of relationship driving it, or that of a happy ending of any kind, actually. There are other genres that do have a specific ending expectations, by the way. Romance is not entirely unique. It's just one of the few that has it. Mystery, for example, requires that the mystery is solved at the end. Or a tragedy requires a rip your heart out, tragic, sad ending where, most of the cast dies, that sort of thing. Right? Fantasy does not have those requirements. Fantasy has its own set of requirements, such as supernatural magic systems and potentially different settings and stuff like that, right? But it does not have a happily ending requirement. So you might at first glance think, well, whatever, right? It has romantic in it, but no, romantic in the context of romantic fantasy just means that it is a fantasy book that has a plot line that is romantic in nature, that is important enough to be part of its genre identification. But it can still be only like 20% of the book. It doesn't have to necessarily be as integral as that in a fantasy romance. As such, when you lump them together under Romantasy and you try to recommend books, right? We're not even talking about marketing, just reader to reader trying to recommend a book, and you say, hey, you like Romantasy, right? Try this book. And you are making the person that you're recommending this book to take a massive gamble, because if they're a fantasy romance reader and they're expecting this to be a fantasy romance, but it is a romantic fantasy, they're not going to like the book, right? You have a 50-50 shot of handing a book to a person that they do not want to be reading, which is a failure as a genre, right? When else would you see this, right? What type of genre can you point at where you can recommend a book within that genre and that book be not of the genre that the person is expecting to be reading? It's kind of ludicrous, really. And this goes both ways, by the way, right? Readers that are primarily fantasy readers that don't want a romance-forward narrative are then frustrated with a lack of extremely in-depth world building and lack of fantasy elements in fantasy romance. And it just creates upset readers across the board. And even more so, it creates very confused authors. There's a lot of questions, roaming around Reddit, Substack, YouTube on what are the actual requirements for a romantasy. Does it have to be like a 50-50 between a romance and a fantasy book? Does it require a happily ever after for just the romantic pairing? Or in general, it has to have a happy ending at the end? Is that requirement for each book in a series or just at the end of a series? How much world building are we expecting? And this creates the kind of hodgepodge that I think readers are seeing. It's kind of a self-fulfilling negative snowball prophecy, where the romantasy specifically as a genre becomes more muddied. And so then authors trying to write to that genre are getting mixed understanding of what is expected out of them. And so you actually get worse book quality out of no fault of the authors per se. And you get hot takes on Romantasy being misogynistic or bad or, being incohesive and stuff like that, not because Romantasy itself or Romantasy readers are bad, or even that the authors are doing anything wrong. They're just trying to design books for a genre that doesn't exist. They're placing romance characters into fantasy plots or vice versa. They're placing fantasy characters that do not have to be designed to be part of a romantic relationship into romance plots. And it causes a lot of just disconnect in the characters and plots. And I think that this is a major problem, right? The biggest thing that Romantasy can do, I think, is to either define itself as something. In my personal opinion, that would be a definitive 50-50 split. Or, in a weird way, not try to market as itself as Romantasy, but let the books be fantasy romance or romantic fantasy. I think this will allow more readers and writers to find their audience easier, and create an overall happier requirement. Now, with all of this, you might be asking, where does Reasons Found in Promises fall? And I genre identify Reasons Found in Promises as an urban fantasy monster romance. A little bit of a mouthful, but if you want to shorten that, it's a fantasy romance. The plot is romance forward. Nothing happens without Zoe and Ronan and their relationship and how it progresses throughout the book. So it is definitely more for the fantasy romance readers who want a low fantasy, more urban setting than, say, high fantasy. Right. So what do you think? Let me know in the comments if you think that Romantasy fails as a genre, or do you think I'm completely bonkers and Romantasy is just fine as it is? Do you blame authors, readers, hey, publishers even, who are trying to push this Romantasy label in order to market to the most amount of people without regard for the reading experience that it causes? Or is it just a kind of byproduct of the popularization of both romantic fantasy and fantasy romance books? All right. I will see you guys in the comments. Remember to check that notification button and subscribe, and check out my works outside of YouTube. Thank you all and have a wonderful day. Happy reading.